Hey guys, it's Nick. Welcome to another episode of T-365. Today's episode, we're going to deep dive into how you can secure access on personally owned devices across your customer environments. We'd love to say, hey, just manage devices, only the ones that have our RMM software, along with being enrolled into Intune with our MDM level policies being applied. But the reality is we're constantly going to get requests from customers to allow them to extend their flexibility to sign into their email or to view documents on their personally owned devices. So I want to make this video to show you the best practices where you can limit their access in those environments to really secure those down as much as possible while still extending that flexibility. So a lot to cover today, a lot of the end user experience I'm going to show you, as well as far as what messaging that they see when they try to access things, what we would consider to be non-compliant locations, but still on those personal devices. So stay tuned for that. As always, if you guys like this content, go ahead and like and subscribe. Otherwise, let's go ahead and dive in. Okay, so before I get into showing you the policies you can configure and that end user experience as far as the demo goes, I want to cover some of the fundamentals here so you understand why it's so important and the basic concepts that we're implementing here as well. When we think about our basic architecture for what we're doing here, we're really looking at Entra being the center of this ecosystem. And whether or not you are cloud native or you have local AD running and you're syncing devices up into Entra, the concept of a corporate device is either Entra ID joined or hybrid joined. And ideally, from there, you're going ahead and these devices are automatically being enrolled into Intune as well too for further configuration, further management with MDM policies, specifically compliance policies, to know that this device is in a quote-unquote healthy state. Now when we think about this really in the health of our device and the configuration really extends beyond just Microsoft for us as MSPs. And this is obvious, but I just want to call it out here, why it's so important that we have these corporate devices, one of which is that we're deploying other applications, other pieces of software that make up our security stack, our RMM software being one of the most primary ones that's doing patching today for us. And that includes extending that patching into third-party apps as well. We also have our antivirus protection. In some cases that's Defender we're using. In a lot of cases though, it's a third-party tool that we're using and layering in. The same thing with our EDR protection that we deploy. That might look like SentinelOne for some of you today versus, again, using Defender for Endpoint in the Microsoft stack. And in a lot of cases, we have all this stuff going on. We have the signature updates going to our AV software, and then we have other things going on, just like the basic configuration that applies additional security protections to the OS itself, in this case Windows, for the things that we're doing. And holistically, when we get into Intune, we can also look at compliance. And that is just basically saying we've configured these settings that says this device is in a quote-unquote, again, healthy state. And so this is very important, that we have these devices in here and that they're corporate owned because they have all of our protections here from the standpoint of what we're doing. But the other consideration, I think, just in the general sense, if we think about other concerns you would have outside of general weakness in attack surface here, or I should say just kind of an expansion of your attack surface, is really around data exfiltration. And so when a user accesses, let's just say this is a personal device, when a user accesses their data here, let's just say this is a file that they have on their personal device, they can technically download this locally, and that can sit, in their native Windows Explorer and things like that, in their native drive on that personal device. And if you think about this could be a highly sensitive document, that they're really just exfiltrating locally, and they may not, most cases, not doing this maliciously, but this is where you start to have data sprawl in a lot of cases, and you really start to ask yourself, would I want this really sensitive document, whether that's HR, finance, etc., IP related, being downloaded locally to this personal device as well too. So when we consider this between, customers asking us to say, hey, I need to have access on a personal device. I need to be able to access my email on my personal laptop, or I need to be able to access these files and have that level of flexibility. And they can't really budge on your pitch that I'm protecting you with my security stack here. It is always going to inevitably come up. I'm going to go ahead and recommend, the ways in which we can do that while providing them this access, but restricting that down so that they can do so in the most secure way we know possible. So again, when we think about the types of ways you can support personal devices, really there's three major buckets. And the first one is what you're always going to be trying to go for and trying to pitch, which is just not supported. We're going to block access. You're not going to be able to access on the corporate device. I see a lot of people also maybe do VPN plus personal device here. And while this is additional security, you're allowing them to move into more of a protected network, it does not overcome the fact that their machine as a whole might be out of date from the security patches, or there might be active malware on that device. So while this is better, I still would prefer not supported whatsoever in that particular sense. Second of which is what I'm going to highlight in this video, which is just simply limited support. So we're saying, hey, I'm going to give you access through your personal laptop to these applications and corporate apps, but you're not going to be able to do everything that you could on your corporate device, and you're only going to be able to access it in restricted locations. And that'll become more clear as we outline that fully. Last of which, in the sense of the bucket, obviously is fully supported. And that, when we get into that, really want to layer in MDM, and I'll get into that here in a second. When we think about limited though, and when we talk about limited, we really want to do the protections, or have the protections that help us, number one, check this box and say, hey, I'm preventing data exfiltration, but also I'm kind of limiting the attack surface on this unprotected device. And there's a couple ways we can do this here. And the one I'm going to show you here that you can perform is web-only access. And that applies to all the documents across SharePoint, across Teams, across your email environment as well too. So you can really just say, hey, you can only get access by going to a web browser versus going to the desktop applications where they might be a little bit more exposed. The other, which again, when we get into that concept maybe of the download, here is saying that I'm going to prevent you from downloading to your personal device. Again, checking the data exfiltration box as much as we can, and we'll be able to see that through the demo. The other limited support here that I'm going to show you is a managed browser. And so effectively within the managed browser, you can kind of extend what you're doing in web-only access, and you could limit copy-paste capabilities in that particular environment, so they can't copy things that are in their Word doc and paste it into the local Notepad app on their device as well. I'm going to show you how to do that, and that really gets into a lot of the protections as well too. And then the same thing applies here when we talk about mobile access. So this is probably more of a volume than you'll get just saying I need to access personal laptops. I need to access, or I want to access data on the go, specifically maybe Teams and Outlook, given that's probably the most volume you're going to see, versus saying I need to modify a document on the go. It's usually a lesser of a use case there. So I'm going to show you how to do that securely so you can encrypt the data. You can wipe the data remotely off of this, and then you can apply additional security protections like a PIN. And that allows us to really lock down these applications on the mobile devices. We can prevent access to the native mail client, things like that, and all that's going to be supported here. Full support, again, if you're going to do this, there's multiple tranches, if you will, for what you could do here. And if I was going to fully support these, I would enroll them into Intune as part of the MDM solution. But within MDM, I'm going to scope that even further to say, I need this to be at a minimum OS, right? I need this to be at a certain level of OS to have the patching, in place that gives me further protection. I don't just want, any device to be able to go on and basically configure, or enroll and start to manipulate this data. I could also scope this down, to have certain compliance policies apply as well too, and you can do it that way. But when you get into this, when it's not your full stack of products, you get into a lot of operational complexity to the extent that it just creates a lot of inefficiency. And I think you have to just scope policies differently when you consider, a corporate or personal device. So that's not something that we really want to do. So fundamentally, in this video, what I want to do, is show you how to provide web-only access on personal devices. I'm going to show you how to provide mobile access securely. I'm going to show you how to prevent download or block download. I'm going to show you how to use a managed browser. And prevent cut, copy, paste capabilities across these as well too, just so you have that fundamental coverage. And really, if you do this, probably the most secure that you can get for allowing and extending that support to a personal device, and you can mix up your conditional access policies with that. So fundamentally, two major solutions again that we're going to use to accomplish this. Conditional access policies and Intune, and then, if you really wanted to call it out, is SharePoint admin settings. But fundamentally, what these do is create conditional access policies on your behalf, but you'll see all that. And on that note, let's go ahead down that we have these concepts and dive into the actual policy configuration and the end user demo so you can see what that looks like. Okay, let's walk through some of the policies that you can configure and view the end user impact. So I want to first show you guys just kind of locking users out completely from personal device or personal device use and some of the best practices around that. So one of the fundamental things obviously you're going to be interacting with is conditional access policies, and one of the most restrictive conditional access policies that you can create, I just call this managed device. But effectively here, we're scoping this to all apps, all users. I'm excluding a break glass account. But in the conditions here, I have any device, and we're excluding the mobile platforms. Really are isolating this to Windows devices in here for this example. And then in the grant controls, you're saying we're going to require the device be marked as compliant, or we're going to require the Microsoft Entra hybrid join device. So with this policy in place, let's take a look at that via a end user experience on a device that is quote unquote personal. All right, so I'm here on a VM that's not enrolled, and I'm acting as a user trying to access maybe from a personal device. So I've downloaded Teams here, and I'm going to go ahead and try to sign in. And after I'm signing in, I'm going to get this message that basically says this application contains sensitive information can be accessed from compliant devices or applications. So the only thing I don't like here is that it gives them the ability to go ahead and try to join the device via the work and school settings, and it's not necessarily something I would want to have that done. So just keep that in mind as far as the workflows goes. If I opened up Chrome as an example here, if I'm a user trying to sign in via browser instead of through the Office applitions, I can sign in here. Use my account here, and I get the same message. And it's really similar here. You don't get that work or school join type of messaging here, but you do get this use case. So the other browser obviously is Edge. I'm going to sign into Edge again with just a different account, but just kind of showing the workflow here. The only thing that might be different here with Edge in the sense of what the user sees is that they're going to get this message, hey, maybe you need to sign in with your work or school account, and then I can try to go ahead and sign in with a managed profile. And if I go back to Office here, the one thing I noticed is that the user's stuck in kind of a loop here, and it's very interesting, kind of confusing, frustrating end user experience where I just get told, hey, switch to a profile. I try to do so, I get the prompt to sign in, and then I'm redirected back to the same page here. So the other way to look at this is if you go in and you say, hey, I want to just go ahead and sign into my managed account here. Again, we'll be prompted to sign in. And then I'm going to put in my MFA token. And we get the same prompt inadvertently. So it's just kind of a janky workflow given its Edge. You can have this managed profile, but it all results in the same flow for the end user. Back in the Entra portal, if you go to one of these users and you go to the sign-in logs to see this, you can actually see the policy being applied. So it's got that notice here for, we need to have a compliant device, or it's got to be joined to our Active Directory environment. And you can see under the conditional access policies, this has our failure, and that is the conditional access we were looking at, and it failed on this grant control of requiring a compliant device. The other way that you might configure this profile that actually gets rid of that prompt for being able to sign in with a work or school account if it's a personal device is you have the same scope here at the top for all users, all resources, but then under the conditions here, you're going to go into filter for devices, and we're explicitly going to exclude the users where the device ownership either equals company or the trust type, in this case, equals Entra join if I'm just looking at a cloud-only environment. So I could technically add another expression if this was a hybrid environment and say we want it to equal Microsoft Entra ID hybrid joined, as that is applicable. And then in the grant controls, instead of saying I require, or at least you're requiring the grant access, but requiring the device to be marked as compliant or the hybrid device, you're just blocking the access there. And I think this is helpful in the sense where you might not be adopting Intune compliance completely just yet because you haven't got to that maturity state, or because you just don't trust it's very disruptive. And I think that's applicable, like I mentioned before, for a lot of businesses that I see and consult with. This end user experience, again, if I am looking at signing into the desktop client for Teams here, I don't even get prompted for MFA. It just says, you can't access this right now. Your sign-in was successful, but doesn't meet the criteria to access this resource. So it's a little bit better, even that I don't have to have that deep link into saying, hey, if this personal device, go ahead and try to join it to Entra. So back to show our sign-in logs here. I also signed in from a compliant corporate-owned device as well, just so you could see the differences here. And so we have that same policy that had the sign-in failure, and it didn't meet these requirements of the exclusion here for the filter that we have for devices, because it's not a corporate-owned device, it's not an Entra join, it's not Entra registered and whatnot from there. And then this is a sign-in from a device that is in that bucket, and you see here it was not applied. So basically it met the criteria of this filter device, and we didn't need to block it because it was under that bucket. If you guys are adopting Intune as well, it's likely that you have auto enrollment turned on. So if a user tries to sign into one of the desktop clients for Teams or Word or whatnot, they're going to be prompted here to say, yeah, let me enroll my device. And that's something that we want to block if it's a personal device as well. Really want to control the devices that are listed in here to only corporate-owned devices. Ideally, from a Windows perspective, we're using autopilot instead of having these personal devices show up In here, we want them to be only corporate-owned devices. A whole blog post on how things get classified as corporate or personal. So look into that if you're not as familiar on that front. But one of the things that we want to do here is we want to go under the devices section. And from the devices section here, we want to go into Windows and then Windows Enrollment. And then under Windows Enrollment here, we have device platform restriction settings that we can configure. And under the enrollment restrictions, if you wanted to say, this is just modifying the default, you can go into the properties here and you can edit the platform settings. And effectively here, for Windows devices, you could block personally owned devices as well. And so that way, if a user does go through that registration flow, they are not actually going to be able to enroll their device under the MDM solution. And that would be the preferred preference for everything that you're doing here as far as just restricting access into corporate-owned devices that are enrolled in MDM. Now, as we switch into supporting personal devices, but this limited use when we talk about web-only access, one of the easiest ways to create policies around that is to go to the SharePoint Admin Center, go under Policies and Access Control, and click on this Unmanaged Devices. And this is going to bring up the settings that you have here as well. And by default, it's going to be set to this top one, which is to allow full access from desktop apps, mobile apps, and the web. And then, if we want to configure this further, you could either block access to say that, again, we don't want any devices to be able to access this, or go allow this limited web-only access. And when you configure this for SharePoint specifically, you're going to go ahead and you're going to set up some conditional access policies. It's going to auto create those for you. And so in my environment here, we have these couple. I actually duplicated these. There's only going to be 2 that it creates. It's going to have this prefix of SharePoint Admin Center there, so it's been created by that, and also has the date of which you created it as well. So it's going to create one if you use the web-only access that says block access from apps on unmanaged devices, and then use app enforced restrictions for browser access. So if we take a look at these, I think when we take a look at the blocking of access from unmanaged devices here, the main thing that it's doing here is we're still saying we're including all users in our bucket, but it's only selecting SharePoint Online as far as our configuration goes. And then in the conditions section, the other thing that it's doing here is that it's only including the mobile apps and desktop clients for that configuration, but under the grant controls, we're still requiring the device to be marked as compliant or requiring the Microsoft hybrid join device. So if we take here a look at this end user experience, if I try to sign into the desktop client again for Teams here, I'm going to get that exact same experience because it's still blocking access on these desktop clients as well too. But if I go back to my browser here and I'm in Chrome and I try to go sign into Office, I actually have direct access in here. So I don't get any type of blocking activity going on, and I'm signed into my account. I didn't get any types of prompts that just flowed through my basic authentication there. Back in our conditional access policies, if we look now at the other one that was created here for the app enforced restrictions for these browser protections, again here we have the app that's included is the SharePoint Online. I think the important thing to call out here is that, as you notice, this was only scoped to SharePoint Online, but because that is the backbone to the Teams document repositories, it also prevented us from accessing Teams as well, which I think was an interesting component of this, not something you would natively think of, but it did protect that, and it obviously extends. And when we think about SharePoint Online, it obviously extends into the Word application, PowerPoint application, etc., just because that's where our documents are being stored. So you do not need to go ahead and say, oh, I need to target those applications directly. It's going to work just using this one specifically. And then under the conditions for this one, this is specifically targeting the browser in this case, not the mobile or desktop applications. We're not, enforcing anything. We're just going to say grant access with no barriers to that. But for the session, we're using these app enforced restrictions. And this is where the prevention of download comes into play. So back on the end user experience, let's say they, obviously they sign into the browser here. Now they're trying to open up an Excel doc. In this particular case, could be a Word doc, could be a PowerPoint. All of it's only accessible online, but they do get this message that says your organization doesn't allow you to download, print, or sync using this device. To use these actions, use a device that's joined to the domain. And so that's really cool because you get that level of visibility that's kind of giving that feedback loop to the user. And then if they were to go and say, I want to save as or download, they don't have any of those capabilities. So this comes back to the helping with that data exfiltration piece and just making sure that data is not being saved locally to devices that you don't manage, you don't have wipe capabilities over, or you don't have your full protection or security stack. Now it's important to call out here that when you take a look at your selected apps here, as far as what you're looking for excluding, if you want to do the same thing with email, you need to look up Office 365 Exchange Online. And that's the target app that you're going to apply for Outlook and for email protections as well. So you'd want to scope that in if you want to move outside of just documents and move directly into documents in email. So as we shift here to looking at access and providing access on mobile devices that's still secure, I think it's very important to look at, because even if we do provide, access to corporate-owned devices, in a lot of cases, this is at least going to be the follow-up. I want to look at my data on the go, specifically probably email and maybe Teams, if you're using that as your primary chat application, because that's helpful to do as far as, getting on meetings, chatting, and looking at your email. So the first primary consideration is setting up app protection policies in Intune. This is the MAM, or mobile application management side to Intune. When you go to create a policy, you'll have these abilities to create it against iOS, Android, Windows, and then Windows information protection I'll get into, but that's being deprecated. So not something I advise setting up today. But if I go into iPad iOS, we're just going to say test for this. You just create a name and description. When you say what apps do you want to apply here, they've done a nice job about bucketizing what I would want as preference, which is the core Microsoft apps, getting back to what I was mentioning: Outlook, Teams, Word, PowerPoint, Excel, things like that. And I'm not going to go through this completely just because I've done a whole video on this, and you can actually see the full end user experience as well here too. I will link that below for what they see on that device, but I think this is really great because not only do you get to apply additional protections like, saving as into non-managed locations like Google Drive or the local file app on there, but you get to encrypt your org data, don't allow them to print, things like that as well. But then you also can set additional security requirements like a PIN in order to access that. And they can have a timeout. So they have to put in that PIN after a certain number or minutes of inactivity. And you could also make them sign in directly. That's a little bit more user non-friendly, if you will, where it's like prompting them to re-log in over and over again. So you don't really like that. But the other thing here is it's automatically going to block access on jailbroken or rooted devices. And then if you're offline, meaning you haven't signed in or you haven't accessed the app in a certain number of days, we're automatically going to go in and just wipe the data. So that's really cool too, just so you have those protections. And it's not saying you're wiping the data across everything. It's just saying on that device, we're going to wipe the data. And they can obviously just like re-sign back in and get back access to their information. But, if they're dormant, it's really giving further protections there. You can assign this out. I'm not going to show Android because it's very similar, just maybe more unique to that OS. But it's very important that you kind of look at these protections and settings there to apply to certain users. The other really cool function is that if you combine this with conditional access policies, you can actually restrict use to native applications, meaning you can block users from entering or adding their email to the native mobile app and mobile mail app, if that makes sense. So if I pivot back over to Entra, I have this policy in here that says requiring app protection. And within here, you could say all cloud applications, you could include certain conditions. In this case, what we're going to do is we're going to target these device platforms as well. And really you could just target iOS and Android if you want to start there. Put in Windows in case you wanted to use MAM settings for Edge, and I'll get to that here in a second. But effectively here, you're requiring the approved client app or accruing app protection policy as well too. This one, like it's mentioning, is going to retire soon. It's going to be fully embodied in this particular setting, but this would allow you so that when a user goes and they say, I want to add my email account, to the native mail app on iOS, it's actually after they sign in, it's going to say, hey, your organization protects this to a managed application. It's going to redirect them to the Apple Store, Google Play Store, depending on what phone or mobile device they're using, and have them download Outlook as a managed application if it's not already downloaded. Otherwise, it'll just redirect them to that application. And then you have your app protection policy, which crypts the data, allows you to remotely wipe that off the device if it's lost or stolen, and also allows you to apply those additional security protections. So this is another great one, I think, and I put it as a baseline for all of the clients that we manage, just because it is giving users that flexibility to access their data on the go, but giving us the most protection as well too. So the other consideration here is requiring a managed browser, such as a managed profile on Edge. We saw some of that in the sense of the user flow around, being able to configure that managed profile. But the benefits of doing so is that a user can't just sign into something like Chrome and you have less protections that you can apply. And again, this comes back to our app protection policies that we can create. So if I go into a Windows policy today and I just say this is another test, the only app that we have in here is Microsoft Edge. And really, this used to be controlled through Windows information protection policies. And I actually like those a lot more because it gave us native abilities to restrict, cut, copy, paste, all of that across the desktop clients, the browsers, no matter what it was. You had those restrictions in place, and they couldn't copy things, to a Word document to their notepad locally, as an example of that. And that was really great. But, this is a policy that you can create for Windows, and you can say, hey, I want to, require, and we'll get to the conditional access policy. You can say it can receive data, but you can prevent it from, moving it outside of that ecosystem. You say you can block printing of the org data as well too. And similar to what we saw on the mobile devices, you can have, the ability to wipe data off of that as well. It could also require that the device be at a minimum OS level. So maybe it's saying, hey, we've got a really outdated device. We don't want you to access this data whatsoever, in those senses, because that's just getting way too unprotected. And then you have the ability to go ahead and push that policy out to certain users or groups. If you pair that with a conditional access policy, this is where you get into your conditions and you say the device platform is going to include Windows, and that's going to require, the profile on Edge to be set up. And if a user tried to access their work or school account via Chrome, it's going to say, hey, you can't access this from here. You're going to have to use Edge as the browser. And it would just simply redirect them to using Edge. So that's another way that you could lock things down even further. I think it gets into, a little bit of a medium balance between, at the most lax position, we get into saying you could access your data on personal devices. Next step up is restricted access in any browser, but we're going to limit you to web only. And then the next step up is, we're going to require you to use not only restricted access, but we're also going to require you to have this managed browser. And then all the way up to you need a corporate device. So kind of some layers there that you can use as far as negotiating flexibility, while also trying to maximize the security of that as well too. Because if you do this, you would have to say, hey, you got to be using Edge to do this as well, obviously. So a little less flexibility for the users, especially ones that prefer other browsers, most popular being Chrome. If you want further granularity in the data that you're protecting or anything that you have maybe on unmanaged devices, things like that, this is where you get into some of the purview and compliance settings. This is where I think in this space especially, there's a lack of understanding. I think this in and of itself, I'm going to create a whole different video around just for the depth of it. But really, if you wanted to get into this, you can get into Endpoint DLP. And when I do this and I go into creating a policy here, I can actually target more sensitive types of information and get into more of the, what does sensitive data mean to me as a business and how do I want to granularly protect that? So you have your predefined PII in a sense here, right, that you could get into. That's like, hey, I'm a HIPAA client. I want to protect things like, PII identifiers, insurance files, things like that, physical addresses from being detected. And when you do get into that, you have predefined templates, or you could use a custom template to try to go target specific resources. But you have in here this devices section as far as what you want to target, and you can uniquely scope it to just the devices, and you could further, scope that to just personal devices by clicking on edit here, and you could exclude certain users or groups. This might be where you have a dynamic group that's looking for personally owned devices, or you target this at personally owned devices and exclude corporate owned devices, right, as part of this policy. And within here, you get into a lot of these various settings and the information to protect, and then you get into some of the protection actions as well. And you can get into these restricted activities on devices. And this is where, you have the ability here to go into some of these restrictions here, depending on what you're getting into. And this is where it gets really granular as far as cut, copy, paste abilities, copying it to a removable USB, printing capabilities, all of this as well. So again, way too much information to kind of cover in this video alone. I wanted to reference it because if you do need that level of configuration and that level of depth, this is kind of how you start to parse out and get into, the granular controls specific to these devices and specific to certain subsets of information, if you really wanted to get into that as well too, or levels of activity from a user. So just wanted to point it out. It's another way you can begin to granularly protect data, still provide access on a personal device using data loss prevention. The last thing I wanted to cover here, let's go back to this example. Let's say the customer is basically requiring you, or you have this requirement to support devices, personal devices really, in MDM. And what does that look like as far as what policies you're going to be applying? And when I say that, I mean when you get into the device configuration profiles, device compliance policies, they might look different for corporate devices versus your personal devices. A good example of that is that you might have a configuration profile that deploys OneDrive to all your corporate-owned devices, but if you have personal devices that are enrolled, you don't actually want the OneDrive being pushed out and configured on those devices. You want to keep everything maybe web-based still, or have that limited access. So in order to do this really well as far as the assignments goes, in a lot of cases we're saying we're going to assign this policy to all users or all devices. And what you can do is you can leverage filters to create a filter for personal devices. And this is giving you the ability, kind of like dynamic groups, to really scope things down. So I can say in the rule syntax, we're just saying based off one of these categories, device ownership equals personal. And that's really simplistic in nature. But when I get back into my configuration profiles, if I go back into this OneDrive sync, you also have the capabilities. If we look at the assignment section here, I have all devices, but I could say, we want to edit the filter and I want to edit filter devices in assignment. And I could say I want to filter it based off of excluding personal devices from this. So no longer am I being, applying all of this policy for OneDrive syncing to all devices. I'm excluding those personal devices and being able to save this as well too. So that's only being applied to corporate owned devices. So I think it's important to call that out if you do have to support that model and have different policy configurations for corporate versus personal within your ecosystem. Okay guys, that's everything I had for you today. Definitely comment below with any questions you have about the content that I covered today. I know that was a lot to go through, but I have a blog post that I'll supplement below that has all of this information in it as well, some helpful links for the policies that you saw here today as well too. So as always, like and subscribe if you guys want to see more content around Microsoft and the MSP space. Otherwise, I'll see you guys next week.